Hello there, it's Telebate here. I've got my weekly Legends of Runeterra video for all of you. With the new patch releasing today, I have 4 decks to help you climb in Call of the Mountain, all using new cards. From experience in previous patches, generally the meta at the start of a new patch is really aggressive and only moves to control later on in the patch, when those decks become refined. For example, on the last balance patch, discard aggro was very popular and then fell off towards the end of the patch. Because of this, I've focused on more aggressive decks in this video, because these are the ones I expected to be more popular early on in the patch. The decks I'll be covering in this video are a Nocturne Nightfall deck, a Lulu Demacia deck, a Celestial deck, and my favourite deck concept of the 4, a Taric Lee Sin deck. I will say, as there's been no experience playing any of these decks, obviously they're not refined. But I will do so once the patch releases, and I'll release videos on these decks if they turn out good. And just as a warning, it's currently Monday and Aurelion Soul has just dropped, so I haven't seen all the cards for this patch yet, so some of the new cards might change some of these deck builds, but there's been enough cards so far that I think I can pull some good decks together. Starting off with the first deck, the Nocturne Nightfall deck. This is a fearsome Nightfall deck, and it's mostly based around Nocturne. The idea of the deck is to use your fearsome units for some early Nexus damage, and then use Nightfall units to level Nocturne. And your win conditions with this deck are flipping Nocturne and using his effect to get a lot of fearsome attacks off, or using Harrowing as your win condition. Going into the deck list, in the deck I'm running 3 copies of Fading Memories. This is a great card for Nightfall. It's 0 cost and can trigger your Nightfall, allowing you to play your units on curve. Additionally, it can be used on Nightfall units to give you additional Nightfall units to help level Nocturne. The deck runs 3 copies of Lunari Dustbringer. This is just a staple in Nightfall decks. I run 3 copies of Stygian Onlooker, and although it's not that strong card, it fits the game plan of running a fearsome Nightfall unit. I run 3 copies of Diana, and although the deck isn't focused around Diana, she's a solid Nightfall unit, and if you can level her up, that's a bonus. In the deck I run 3 copies of Mist Wraith, Risen Mists, and Wraithcaller. This is the whole Mist Wraith package where you can summon up to 9 Mist Wraiths, and that can get them up to 11 attack, which is just nuts, and it fits in with the fearsome game plan. In the deck I run 3 copies of Pale Cascade, and this is just a nuts card. Even outside a Nightfall deck, I'll probably be running 3 copies of this, and the fact that it is Nightfall as well just makes it all the better. The other draw tool I run is Stalking Shadows, which I run 3 copies of as well. This is just great for getting you extra Nightfall units to level up Nocturne, and fits perfectly with the game plan. I run 3 copies of Unspeakable Horror, and this is another way to generate more Nightfall cards to help level Nocturne. I run 2 copies of Doombeast as I needed more Nightfall units to flesh out the deck, but I didn't want to go into the Targon Nightfall units as I'd reduce the chance of an Allegiance proc from Wraithcaller, so therefore I went with Doombeast. I run 3 copies of Frenzied Skitterer. This helps tremendously in the early game to help get your fearsome attacks off and get that early chip damage into the Nexus, which is so vital for being able to win with this deck. Obviously I run Nocturne. This is the whole champion the deck has been built around. The last cards I run are 2 copies of the Harrowing, and this will be helpful giving the deck the extra reach it needs to finish off games, especially in those situations where your board is wiped and you're running low on cards, then you top deck the Harrowing, play the Harrowing, your opponent can't answer it because you have so many fearsome units, and you win. Overall I think this deck will be a fairly good aggressive deck, and it's kind of similar to old Spider fearsome decks of the past. Moving on to the next deck, this is a Lulu Lucian deck, and this deck concept originally came from League. So I used to play a lot of Lulu and Lucian bot lane with my duo partner, and then when Lulu got released in Runeterra, I was thinking about how I could make these 2 work, and it actually makes a lot of sense, because Lulu synergizes well with aggressive decks, and particularly Demacia because of Fleet Feather Tracker. Additionally, the support effects synergize very well with Rally, because you can proc them multiple times in the same turn, and you can even proc them on the defending turn. The idea of this deck is very simple. You just play units on curve, try and outvalue aggressive decks, and you try and beat down any slower decks. I did originally create 2 versions of this deck. One of them was a Bannerman concept, but I decided to scrap that concept as it would be more interesting to utilise more of the new Ionia cards. Going through the deck, I run 3 copies of Fleet Feather Tracker. This is a great challenger unit and will synergise really well with Lulu. I run 3 copies of Flower Child as well, and I thought about using Cyphria, but overall I think there's so many support cards in this deck, it just makes sense to run Flower Child. I run 3 copies of Ranger's Resolve. This deck could be quite vulnerable to AoE board wipes, so Ranger's Resolve is a great way to protect against them. I run 1 copy of Rush, and I think this just helps being able to attack with your support units like Lulu. I run 3 copies of Lucian, he's just a fairly strong early game unit. The aim of this deck is not to level him up. I run 2 copies of Single Combat just for some removal. The deck runs 3 War Chefs. This is probably the best support unit in the game before this patch, so it's an easy include in this deck. I also run Young Witch, and this is a great support unit because it's elusive, so you're not afraid to attack with it, buffing up one of your other units. I run 3 copies of Laurent Protégé. Again, this is another good challenger unit, which will synergize very well with Lulu. Obviously I run Lulu, this is a champion the whole deck has been built around. I run 2 copies of Relentless Pursuit. As mentioned before, I think rally effects work really well with support decks. I only run 2 copies of it because we're running 3 copies of Lucian, so I have quite a high chance of drawing them as one of his champ spells anyway. I run 2 copies of Fey Guide, and I think this unit can be really strong, especially if you use its effect onto Lulu. One of the biggest weaknesses with Lulu is she's got a weak body, so you'll be afraid to attack with her. If you can make her elusive, then you can freely attack with her and use her to buff up all your units. I run Fezzi Caretaker, and he's only a 3/3, so he's got quite a weak stat line, but his support effects synergize very well with Lulu and the style of the deck. The alternative would be something like Grizzled Ranger, and I just don't think the scout effect is that good in this deck because you're focusing on the support effect, and unless you have a unit which has both scout and support, you're not making the full use out of your support effect. I'm running 3 copies of Radiant Guardian. This is just a very solid unit. It doesn't quite fit in with the aggressive game plan, but I think the unit is just so strong you can't skip it out. Finally, I'm running 3 copies of Cyphria the Bold as the finisher. It was difficult to choose between Cyphria and Genevieve, but overall I think Cyphria fits the game plan. As mentioned before, I don't think Scouts synergize that well with the support effect, and therefore I'd rather go with something like Cyphria, who has a stronger bonus but no scout effect. Moving on to the Celestial deck, the new Celestial cards are a great way of creating a consistent deck. You can run low cost Invoke units and then choose the high cost Celestials, which gives you a small chance of bricking your hand. The problem with a lot of mid-range decks is if you draw the high cost units, you can get your hand bricked and the game can be over before you've even had a chance to play. In this deck, I'm planning to run a lot of low cost Invoke units and then use Invoke to get my end game. Looking into the deck, I'm running 3 copies of Solari Soldier. This is just a very strong 1-drop. I'm running 3 copies of Spacey Sketcher. This is just to provide an early blocker and a Celestial card. I run 3 copies of Behold the Infinite. You probably don't want to draw this early on because you'll rather have one of your Invoke units which has a body as well, but I've included this as an additional Invoke card to help you get that end game. I'm running 2 copies of Guiding Touch just to help cycle the deck and gives you a bit of healing to survive the early game. In this deck I'm running 3 copies of Pale Cascade. In my opinion, this might be one of the strongest cards on the patch. A 2 mana, draw a card and give +2/+1 is just insane in my opinion. I run 3 copies of Solari Shieldbreaker, again another early unit just to help you survive the early game. I run 3 copies of Bastion. This is mainly to protect your champions, which I'll get onto in a moment. I run 3 copies of Lunari Priestess and Solari Priestess just to get more Celestial cards. Additionally, I run 3 copies of Mentor of the Stones. This is just another card to help you survive the early game. I run 3 copies of Bounty Scryer. Reducing the cost of your Celestial cards pretty much makes this a must-have card in this type of deck. I'm running 2 copies of Star Shaping, just because with Invoke you have a higher chance of getting one of the low-cost Celestial cards, but with Star Shaping it has that 7 or more restriction, guaranteeing you one of the endgame finishes. Finally, onto the champions. I run 3 copies of Fresh. This is because you run a lot of low-statted minions, and this can help Fresh level up if you use them as blockers. The main reason I run Fresh is to help you cheap out the next champion, which is Aurelion Soul. Now this card is absolutely nuts, but he costs 10 mana, and therefore you really want to cheat him out with Fresh. If you can get him out with Fresh, I think your opponent will probably just surrender on the spot. Before I get onto the final deck, if you enjoyed the video so far, and want to see some more detailed guides on these and other decks when the new patch drops, please leave a like and subscribe. Also, please comment any deck ideas that you think might be good on this patch. It would be really interesting to get your thoughts. Saving the best to last, this is the Taric Lee Sin deck. The idea of this deck is to survive early and get a lot of value, and then use buffed up Lee Sin kicks to win the game. In the deck, I run 3 copies of Gift Giver to generate gems. I run 3 copies of Claws of the Dragon. We're going to run a lot of spells in this deck, so she'll be coming out of hand very frequently. Similarly, we run 3 copies of Eye of the Dragon. Her effects should be proccing very frequently with this deck. Run 3 copies of Guiding Touch. This will be a great buff card on Taric because you'll be able to draw 2 cards off it. Additionally, it's a cheap spell which fits with the game plan. Similarly to Guiding Touch, we run 3 copies of Pale Cascade, and if you can use this on Taric, you can get the double draw. We run 2 copies of Sonic Wave, again another cheap spell which fits with the game plan. We run 3 copies of Bastion. I really think this card is insane and this will help protect your Taric and Lee Sin. We run 3 copies of Mentor of the Stones. This is a great card and generates 3 gems, so fits perfectly with the game plan. We run 2 copies of Concussive Palm. This is just to help stall out so you can get to your buffed up Lee Sin stage where you win the game. I run 1 copy of Deny, and this was a very hard one to decide on, but because there was so much I was trying to fit in this deck, I really struggled to get more than 1 copy in, but depending on the meta, you might want 2 or even 3 copies of Deny. In this deck I'm running 3 copies of Taric, as he's a great target for all the support cards, and you're not really trying to level him up in this deck as he's got a very difficult level up requirement, but you get an insane amount of value if you manage to double up with one of the draw spells on him. I run 2 copies of Blessing of Targant. Both Lee Sin and Taric are great targets for this. I run 3 copies of Deep Meditation. There are so many cheap spells in this deck that you should be getting the discount very often. I run 3 copies of Lee Sin, and since his release, Lee Sin has never really been popular, but that's because of his weak stat line makes it very difficult to use him as a win condition. The whole idea of this deck is to buff him up so you can use him as that win condition. Finally, I run 3 copies of Arbiter of the Peak. You have so many buffs in this deck that you should be massively discounted. It will be a great tempo play. So that's all the decks I've got for you. Hopefully you can give one of these decks a try. I'm still not sure which one of these I'll try first. I'm torn between the Lee and Lulu decks. Let me know which deck interests you the most in the comments below. As soon as I can, I'll put the deck codes in the description below. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.